We've got a limited amount of time. We really probably need several hours to really properly discuss about transitions and legacy and that type of thing. But I just want to tell you real quickly how our church started. Jeannie and I moved to Colorado with our children in 1986 during the summer on a vision from God. You heard a little bit about that on Monday night. But to just kind of give you some perspective, we started with no people. We didn't have a team. We didn't have money. We didn't have a building. Nobody was waiting on us. We had a vision. And when we paid our first month's rent of $750 and the deposit, we had $400 left to our name. My home was for sale in Louisiana. It had not sold yet. And we had some equity. I wish we'd have had it. But by the time it was all said and done, the dust settled after we were there for about a week. We had $400. We went and opened a church bank account with our last $400. And the first check we wrote was $40 to Ruth and Vic Martinez down in El Carmen in Monterrey, Mexico, as a mission check because we believe in missions. And that's how we started our church, humble beginnings. Our first month's offerings were $253. Jeannie and I gave $200, and we don't know where we got the $200. But one lady and her two small children came to the first service. She brought a guitar, sang 2 songs, sat down on the front row. And my wife took her 2 small children and my 5-year-old daughter to a room next door. We met in the basement of a community college. And she took them to the room next door, did a Sunday school lesson. And Matt was 8 years old, sat 4 rows back, and I preached my heart out. And 3 weeks later, her husband came. Come on, Jesus, we're growing. And we trusted the Lord. For 5 months, we lived by faith. Some of you know what that's all about. For 7 years, we didn't even have health insurance. You know, health insurance does not guarantee health. Have you figured that out? But we trusted the Lord. And so after all these years, now a little over 30 years, we have a tremendous ministry that I think is impacting our part of the city. The city's about 2.5 million people. And my son, whom I love and whom I'm well pleased, is pastoring that church now. And what a blessing and honor it is. You know, when it comes to legacy, it's really about, you know, thinking about your own life. Pastor Matt just said it a moment ago. Everybody's going to make a transition one way or the other. Either God's going to move you on out and you'll go on to heaven, or He'll direct you in how to transition your ministry to some other place. But I think a real leader has to think beyond his own lifetime. And that's what I think I had to do, is destiny forces you to think beyond your own life. And sometimes we have a hard time doing that. We think about who we are, where we are, and what we're doing right now, and sometimes we never move. You know, you can't go someplace unless you leave someplace. And that's what a transition and a legacy is all about. And as I grew older, I began to see and feel a stirring in my heart and spirit that maybe God wanted me to make a transition. And I call that a season. You know, God operates in seasons. I don't know if you know this, but God's seasons are God's movements. And if you want to discern the movement of God, you just need to discern the season. And when one season is expiring, a new one is beginning. And the problem with most leaders is that we never discern the expiring season. You know, God is not obligated to support you outside the season that He's in. Have you figured that out? You know, they have an expiration date on food for a reason. And every one of us have an expiration date. We may not like it, but we have one. I thought I would pastor this church till I was at least 68 or 70, until the Lord spoke to me one day. He said, the longer you wait, the greater disservice you do to the kingdom, to this church, and to men that are ready to run with it. At that moment, I really realized the Lord was about to change the season. I began to feel it, but now I was really sensing the wind of the Spirit of God to make a change. You know, your vision is larger than your current role. Are you hearing what I'm saying this morning? Don't get stuck where you are. Listen, my job as I get older is to dissolve myself into the coming generation. That's my job. And some of you are getting older. How do you dissolve yourself into the coming generation? Let me just give you my philosophy of life real quickly. It's just 3 parts. It's pretty simple. The first third you live for yourself. The second third you live for your children. The third third you live for your grandchildren. I'm in the third third. That's a natural way to look at it. Let me give you the spiritual way. The first third you learn it. The second third you earn it. And the third third you return it. Are you getting this? Now, you're always learning and earning what you've learned. I understand that. But there comes a point in time, it's a breakover point to where you've learned enough and earned enough that you should start giving it away. And that's what I realized God wanted me to do. You know, God gave me a vision for a church, but He began to stir me to have a vision for the church. And so now I've moved from the left seat to the right seat. My son has the steering wheel. I'm just a passenger now. I mean, the boy that I spanked his rear end 200 times is now my pastor. Go figure that out. But seasons are going to change whether you like them or not, whether you accept them or not. Okay, here's what I want to do, because I don't have but a short time that I'm going to have my son come up and share his perspective. And then we're going to take a few minutes for Q&A, for some question and answers. You might have some, and we'll do our very best to answer them. We've had a very, very successful transition, and I'm so pleased with that. But there were three things that really caused me, these were the three spiritual steps that I took to make the transition. I don't have time to go through the whole process today. Maybe sometime in the future we can come back and maybe talk about it. But here are three things that might help you. Number one, you have to find your Elisha. First of all, I'm going to give it to you. Selection, preparation, and release. Those are the three things. Selection, preparation, and release. Those are three things that the Lord spoke to me about. I have to be Elijah and find my Elisha. And you have to find somebody that's out there that has the same heart and spirit that you do. But I had to find my Elisha. Now, I didn't know if it was going to be my son or a spiritual son. I just didn't know. Look, this is not my ministry, so I don't have the right to give it away. It's God's ministry. I have the right to manage it and to steward it. And by the way, it's easy to give away something you spent the best years of your life doing when you don't own it. And I didn't own this ministry. I started it, yes. God used me, yes. It grew, yes. We built big buildings, yes. Did all those kind of things. But it was easy for me to give it away because I did not own it. But it started with trying to find my Elisha. And I believe God will show you who is to carry your mantle. That has, my son has my DNA. A spiritual son would have my DNA, spiritual DNA. They would have my same values, principles, what I call the non-negotiables that every leader ought to have as non-negotiables in their life. I don't care what polls say, what public says, what society says, what social media says. You've got to stand on the Word of God. You represent God's Word. You don't represent yourself. And so my son had my DNA. He had my principles, my values, the same non-negotiables. He's just going to do it differently. And that's okay. But I found out that when you have your Elisha, there will be a doubling. Everybody knows the story of the mantle that fell, and Elisha did exactly twice the amount of miracles that Elijah did. See, first of all, you have to find your Elisha. Who is that person? I think that person has to be someone that's already doing the work. You know, when Elijah found Elisha, you know what he was doing? He was out in a field plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. You got to be a man to plow with 12 yoke of oxen. When I looked around, my son was already plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, managing our staff. He was an executive pastor for me. He had led worship for 9 or 10 years in our church, or maybe more. I don't even know now. I mean, he led worship, managed the staff. I allowed him and asked him to develop budgets and manage budgets and money and all these kind of things so he would know what to do internally as well as spiritually. As I looked around, I realized I found my Elisha. He was right there. You know, your Elisha might be right under your nose and you don't even know it. Number one, it's about selection. Elijah had to find Elisha. Number two, you have to be like David to Solomon. You have to prepare. There has to be preparation. You know, here's David, the great king of Israel, and he's laying the foundation of the temple, and God says, hold it right there. You're not going to build the rest of it. He had a vision. See, I had a vision for our church. You know, the vision may transcend, it may go past your lifetime. And so David began to prepare. You can read about it, 1 Chronicles 22. He began to prepare for Solomon, his son, to build the temple. He said, Solomon, he said, God will not let me build the temple. I've laid the foundation, but I've got gold, I've got money, I've got workmen, I've got silver, I've got all these things. Now go build the temple. You know, we serve a multi-generational God, don't we? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Don't get so high-minded that the vision starts and ends with you. You see, I was the foundational leader, legacy leader of our church. My son is the first generational legacy leader, and there will be many more after that, should the Lord tarry. I just happened to be the one that founded and started the ministry. It's what God called me to do. But you've got to be like Elijah, find Elisha. Number two, you have to be like David to Solomon. You have to prepare. You have to prepare for your successor. Now, let me tell you how we did it. We saved a lot of money. I wanted to make sure, we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if people would leave. We didn't know if the offerings would go down, up. I didn't know. How would you know? We didn't know. But I saved enough money that we didn't have to have one offering for over a year to run our church and pay our staff for over a year. Because I didn't want any financial pressure on him. I wanted him to be able to lead the church with fresh vision, hire whoever he wanted. He remodeled the foyer of the sanctuary, the foyer of our building for about $300,000 or $400,000, paid cash for it. He didn't have any kind of financial constraints because I was like David to Solomon. I prepared for him. I paved the way for him. I gave him wheel time so that he could get his hands on the wheel to see what it all felt like. And then the third thing that I did is I wanted to be like Jesus to the disciples. I had to know when to leave. That's the funny part about it. Most of us don't want to leave. You see, when you leave, or you think you're about to leave, you don't feel validated anymore, valued anymore, important anymore. I know, we all go through those kinds of things. But Jesus knew when to leave. Moses said, look, I'm not going to be able to go to the promised land. Joshua, you lead. He knew when to leave. Jesus could have continued another 40 or 50 years easily. He's 33 years old when he left. But see, it's all about the timing of the Lord. You've got to sense, and that's a whole other discussion about the time, the times, and the due seasons of God. That's a whole other topic that we could talk about sometime. But you've got to be like Jesus. You've got to know when to go. You've got to know when to release and let things go. Charles Barkley was teasing LeBron James. Anybody know who LeBron is? And he was on ESPN. It was pretty funny because he said, LeBron, he said, when you first got in the league in the NBA, he said, your headband was way down here, LeBron. He said, but you're getting older, LeBron, your hair's going up. Hey, I noticed your headband is way up here now. LeBron, it's time. LeBron, he was saying, it's time to get rid of that headband, sweatband. You know, you got to discern when the Lord is saying, LeBron, it's time. It's time. The longer you hold on to something that you should have let go, the greater the injustice you've done to yourself, the kingdom of God, and men and women around you that are ready to carry the baton. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. You see, God gave me the baton and let me run my leg of the race. Now, I'm still in ministry. I preach more now than when I was pastoring. I'm thinking about going and pastoring a church so I can slow down. I think last year I spoke to about 10,000 pastors around the world. And this year it'll be even more because of some of the conferences and places we're going to be heading. And I've moved into the apostolic area like a father, spiritual father. I'm not an apostle, but moved into the apostolic area where you train, encourage, and help those that are on their journey. That's really all I'm doing right now. But I want you to know that your future transcends your position. And for me, I'm really excited about the future. And you want to know the reason why I'm excited about my future? Because that's where I'm going to live the rest of my life. My life didn't end when I left our church. I'm still in our church. When I left our church, I had to answer all the questions that people were going to ask before they asked them. No, I don't have cancer. I'm not dying. Number two, I'm not leaving. You're my family. Where am I going to go? Number three, I'm not taking another church. Number four, I'm not retiring. I told them what I was going to do. You know, I had to answer the questions before they were asked. But it was those three things that led us to what I believe is a really good success. Selection, preparation, and release. Be Elijah, find your Elisha. Be like David, prepare for Solomon. And be like Jesus to the disciples and know when to leave. Don't overstay your welcome. Don't be known for how long you stayed. Amen. That's all I've got to say. I'm going to give Pastor Matt, my son, let's give him a good welcome. Love you.
All right, well, let me kind of take it a little different direction. Dad is talking about, kind of from the perspective of the existing leader, the senior leader who maybe was there, was foundational or kind of launched the thing, kind of from an Elijah perspective. Let me talk to the young leaders, talk to the people who are in the Elisha boat, or maybe some ideas if you're coaching an Elisha. If you've got some young leaders around you, maybe these are some things that you can use that will help you as you develop those people around you. Things that I kind of learned that I would not have put maybe in a capsule form like this at the time, but as I look back on it, lessons that I learned and principles that I live by that really I think helped God to breathe on what was happening. Anytime a transition goes well, it's partially because of what you did, hopefully, but it's a lot more because of what the Holy Spirit did, right? And so if we follow principles that are sound, that are wise, that are biblical, all of that, then it positions us for God to breathe on us in those things. So to young leaders, to leaders maybe who are not the senior guy, but maybe you'll become that, or people maybe who you're coaching around you. 3 ideas that I would just encourage you in. Number 1, if you're a young leader, don't jump ship. If you're looking at a transition that's coming up in the future, don't jump ship. The tendency, the temptation, always, a transition process always takes longer and costs more than you think it's going to or than you want it to. Even if if it's not put on paper or whatever, you always have this sense of impatience that I'm ready. I want to have my hand on the wheel. I'm ready to take charge of the situation. And the temptation is that when that's not happening as quickly as you want it to just jump ship. To say, well, if it's not happening here, then I'm going to go somewhere else. If I don't see the result happening here and now, then I'm going to find somewhere else to do it. If you've not sensed God's timing in your life, if you're not patient enough, that temptation to jump ship is very real. 1 Chronicles 12:32 talks about the men of Issachar and how they understood the times, and because they understood the times, they knew what to do. We as young leaders particularly have to understand the times. We have to understand that God works in seasons, like my dad was just saying, and respond appropriately to those seasons. Many young leaders, from my perspective, don't stay in one place long enough to bear any fruit in ministry. They get excited, they come in, they have passion and vision and all of those things, but then when it doesn't seem to be moving fast enough, when they get a better opportunity, they leave without actually being able to see the harvest of the seeds that they have planted. Particularly in our culture, it seems like many people don't stay long enough to actually see results from what they're doing. If you want to come into a church or a ministry, a mission field, whatever the case may be, if you're only going to be there for 6 months, 9 months, a year, there's no fruit that comes from that. I don't know what it officially is, but I've heard a number of people talk about if you're not going to stay in a place for at least 3 to 5 years, you probably aren't going to experience a lot of fruit in ministry. And obviously you want to be sensitive to the seasons that God's moving you in, and I'm not saying that that's a hard and fast rule, but generally, in my experience, more people leave too early, in young leaders I'm talking about, maybe old leaders stay too long, I don't know, but young leaders tend to leave too early. We tend to uproot before God's actually got done what he needs to get done in our lives. So my encouragement is to give that time. The maturing process takes time. And young leaders, and I know because I am one, young leaders are not as mature as they think they are. We may position, we may posture as if we've got it all figured out and we know what we're doing. We don't. Young leaders are not as mature as they think they are. They need a maturing process. My advice to young leaders, my advice to mature leaders who are coaching young leaders is that it's just going to take some time. You can't shortcut these things. If you're not willing to go through a maturing process, if you're not willing to be groomed, you disqualify yourself from the next level of leadership that God calls you to. And you may be called, you may have vision, you may have gifting, but if you're not willing to go through a maturing process, you will disqualify yourself. Dealt with this a lot, with our ministry staff, with volunteers and all these kinds of things. People who have calling, they have potential, they have gifting, but when they won't submit to a growth process, they sort of sabotage what's happening there. Had had a pastor who worked for us. Well, I use the term work loosely, but he was on staff with us. He got a paycheck from us for a while. He was one of those guys who had gifting and personality and charisma and all this stuff. And he came, joined our team in a somewhat, senior level role. And we sat down and I asked him to develop, what did he think his first 90 days with us would look like? And so he said, in the first 30 days, I want to focus on developing relationships. I said, awesome, that's good. He said, in the second 90 days, I want to identify the sacred cows around here. I said, well, okay, that'll be interesting to see what an outside perspective is. And he said, by the time we hit 90 days, we're going to start slaughtering sacred cows. I said, well, let's not rush to the barbecue just yet, So we kind of talked through that, and what it came down to is he was not as mature as he thought he was. He had not bought in. He didn't have the buy-in. He didn't have credibility like he needed to. Now, he had gifting. He had a lot of potential, but it takes time to mature into that. And so once I'm all for moving things forward. I want to see the kingdom advance. I don't want to slow that down, but there's a right timing. There's a season for it. And when I, pulled some reins in, he decided he was going to jump ship instead. Quality man, quality ministry, anointed to do what God called him to do, but he was with us for 9 months. And can I just tell you, someone who's with you for 9 months, when they leave, they've done you more harm than they've done you good. There's nothing they've done in those 9 months that's going to help you. You just got to have messes to clean up. So young leaders, don't jump ship. Older leaders, encourage your people to stay for the long haul, to go through the maturing process, and that's a positive thing, it's a good thing in their lives. You see this with David. 1 Samuel 16, he's anointed to be the king. 15 years later, 2 Samuel 2 is when he becomes the king. A lot happens in those 15 years. If David jumps ship during that time, he's not the king of Israel anymore, right? So encourage your young leaders to not jump ship. Wait, I say, on the Lord, right? Number 2, don't try to take over the ship. Don't jump ship, but don't try to take over the ship either. God does not bless coups. God's not in the business of mutinies. The other temptation for young leaders is, if they're not going to jump ship, to try to take over the ship, to try to grab the wheel before it's really time for them to be in that spot. Dad was referring a minute ago to, driver's seat, passenger seat. Listen, if you're in the driver's seat and somebody reaches over and tries to grab the wheel, you have a problem, right? And you've been in those situations before. Young leaders, don't try to take over the ship. Don't try to grab the wheel when it's not time to do it yet. David had these opportunities. You can read about that in 1 Samuel, multiple opportunities. He could have taken the kingdom of Israel by force. And he was anointed. He was called to be in that role. But he knew that there was a timing for it. He didn't try to usurp Saul's authority. He didn't try to take the ship over for himself. Romans 13:1, those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. We work with this, with our staff all the time. They'll get frustrated. They want, more leadership or these kinds of different things. And we talk about the idea that when that time is right, God's going to open those doors. That whoever's in authority in their life, in their ministry area, their department, whatever the case may be, there is a reason for that. If you have to place yourself in a leadership role, it's probably not God. God does not need your help in opening doors. God does not need your help in creating opportunities. You read about this in 2 Samuel with Absalom. Absalom is a great example of people who want to open their own doors, take over the ship in ministry. Now, it's not that Absalom didn't have gifting. It's not that he didn't have some place, that he had something to bring to the table. But when he tried to force it, he tried to take matters into his own hands, it created problems. Young leaders, here's the temptation in Absalom's story. And I'm just throwing out, a lot of ideas out here. The issue with Absalom is not so much that he couldn't have been qualified to be in a leadership role. It's that he disqualified himself by the way that he conducted his life. When people began to complain about David, he was way too sympathetic of an ear. Young leaders, you will have the opportunity and the temptation, because people will complain to you when they won't complain to the guy they should actually complain to. People won't talk to the guy in charge, they'll talk to someone else. And if you give credit to that, if you lean into that story, you're endorsing what's happening, you're supporting what's happening. And that creates a problem. You will have the opportunity and the temptation to do that. How you handle it matters. You're planting seeds that will produce a harvest in your life. How you deal with, when you're in a subordinate role, how you deal with the complaints, the frustrations, the issues in your church, your missions organization, whatever it is, how you deal with that as it relates to the senior leader. Those are seeds you're planting, and you will produce harvest in your life at some point. Be careful what seeds you're planting. That's a determination I made early on, that I would not be an Absalom. I may not get everything right. I may, fumble over some things, but I'm not going to be an Absalom. I'm not going to live in rebellion. Spiritual authority is never taken, it's always given. You cannot create your own spiritual authority. Don't try to take over the ship. Number 3, the last one, in no particular order, but just sort of lessons we learned along the way, is that you need to honor the past, both the person and the work. You honor the person and the work. So young leaders, this is important. We struggle with this. We tend to want to move so quickly into the next thing. We're in a culture that values new and shiny more than we value, existing or old or whatever. We want the newest iPhone. We want the, whatever's in ministries today, magazine this month. We want our ministries to look like that. We always want to be, have the new thing. And again, I'm not against moving things forward. We should be moving things forward. We should be changing things. We should be advancing the cause of Christ. But we should also be honoring the people that have gone before us. We should be honoring the work of ministry that has happened before us, before we came onto the scene. Someone else has gone before us. Even if you pioneered a work, even if you founded a church, even if you're the first missionary in your part of that nation, guess what? Someone else has still gone before you. Someone else has still planted seeds. Someone else has still tilled up some ground. Someone else has gone before you. So my encouragement to young leaders, and again, if you're coaching young leaders, maybe you can use this with them, is to intentionally honor the people that came before them. Speak well of them, honor them publicly, have an attitude of gratefulness. People's attitude toward your leadership, in some part, is represented by your attitude to the person who led before you. Doesn't it kind of frustrate you when a president spends most of his administration blaming the previous president? Like, we all inherit problems, right? That's life. But at some point, you just own those things and you don't throw the people before you under the bus. It happens in politics, it happens in churches, it happens in business, it happens in families. Listen, honor the people that have gone before you. Now, this is easy because it's my dad, right? It's easy to honor your dad. But I'm intentional about that. I'm intentional. The way I introduce him to our church, I want them to honor him, to praise him, to show respect to him for his work. We make sure that, any opportunity that my dad wants, he's got it. He can come in and do whatever he wants to do. I make sure that he's taken care of financially. I make sure that the people in our church respect him and honor him and admire him. He's the daddy, right? He's the granddaddy now of the church. And so it's important that we honor his work. In addition to that, not just honoring the person, but honoring the work that's gone before us. Young leaders need to bring new things to the table. They need to bring new ideas. If a young leader is just going to do things the same way the old leader did, why bother making the transition, right? I mean, the old guy can just keep doing what he's doing, right? So we need new leaders. We need fresh vision. We need fresh ideas and new methods and all. That's a good thing. But we need to realize that all the stuff that's happening already is there for a reason. That ministry program you want to kill off, God spoke to somebody to start it at one point. Now, it has a lifespan. I'm not saying that you shouldn't kill it off. Lord knows I've been killing off some stuff, and I got a bunch of stuff to kill this year. So it's going to be fun. But somebody somewhere along the way, God spoke to him to start it. God spoke to him to plant it. God spoke to him to get it rolling. And so how do we honor the work that's gone before us? One of my mentors told me about a church that he was a part of back in Missouri, an Assemblies of God church that they knew they needed to revitalize themselves. Their pastor had left. They brought in a young pastor. They said, we want to be relevant to our city. He said, you probably don't know what you're asking for here. We can get there, but this is going to hurt, And so they began to make changes, and one of the longtime members in the church complained to my friend, my mentor, who happened to be on the board. They said, look, we know we've been here for a long time. We know we're kind of old school. That's fine. We know we need to change. We're okay with that. But you made us feel like everything we did was wrong. We're willing to change, we're willing to grow, but don't make us feel like everything we did in the past was wrong. Young leaders, we got to be careful about that. We want to bring change, we want to bring fresh vision, but there's a reason that God called the people who he called and founded the work that he called there before us. So honor the person and the work. Don't jump ship. Don't take over the ship. Honor the people and the work that have gone before you. That's some of my advice to young leaders, and that by God's grace we were able to do that, and I think God blessed that. So.